From the Digital Media Center on the campus of Southern Oregon University in Ashland, Oregon. This is Ramping Up Your English, an educational program for intermediate level English language learners. Here's your host for Ramping Up Your English, John Letts.
Welcome to Ramping Up Your English, winner of the Southern Oregon Television Award for Best Education Show for 2020. I'm your host, John Letts. This show is, as always, a part of our educational series, Ramping Up Your English, and it has to do with using content-based ESL in order to improve your English skills. So we take that content-based approach, and we have a thematic unit from time to time, and the thematic unit we're doing now is on Native Americans. This is segment 1 of episode 98. Now, normally when I do this show, I'm in the studio, so I have a little bit more technology working in my favor, but this is during the COVID-19 period, and so we hope you enjoy today's show and get a lot out of it, even though it may not be quite as smooth as having a whole crew helping me out here. But welcome anyway. We're gonna make this work. Now, in the last shows, the previous shows, we took the incredible history of Native Americans from the time they arrived on the continent over 14,000 years ago and looked at the way that they developed. We looked at certain regions of the country and saw some of the people there and the types of civilizations that they created and developed and that had evolved here, as well as sort of a balance between various groups. Well, in previous episodes, just a couple ago, we have the entrance of the Europeans into this whole thing. Well, that definitely made a huge change. And so what we're looking at today is we want to take that a closer look at that. Okay, so we know that the spearhead of this whole influence from Europe came from Christopher Columbus and his crew that sailed across the ocean and were greeted with a lot of welcome, with kindness. That was a crew that was exhausted from so much time at sea, and the Taino people kind of took them under their wing, nursed them back into health. Christopher Columbus himself described them as extremely generous, very kind, very joyous people who were there when the Spaniards arrived. Even in his own words, we know, because Christopher Columbus wrote letters to the royal family in Spain. Well, we know what the Taínos got in return in terms of their mistreatment by the Spaniards. And it's one of those very tragic stories. This thing opened with a lot of hope that perhaps there could be some kind of a enriching of both cultures. But that's not what happened. There was a terrible violence heaped upon the Taino people. So in this show, we're going to see what happened, not just the events that happened, but how did the Taino people carry on after this huge blow that they took, both to their population and to their culture. So we're going to watch a quick video clip here about whatever happened to the Taino, and we'll be working with some very interesting grammar right after that.
Where was the first place European explorers landed in the Americas? Was it Mexico, the United States, Brazil? Well, actually, it was Greenland over 1,000 years ago. But when discussing the more recent European colonialism, the first ships to set sail from the Old World led by Christopher Columbus landed in an unknown island in the Lucayan archipelago, what we refer to today as the modern-day Bahamas. Subsequent waves of Europeans had very volatile interactions with the natives of these islands, to say the least. But with the introduction of Old World diseases into the native population, their fate was set as soon as the first interactions between these two wildly disparate populations took place. And it's claimed that by the year 1600, only 100 years after first contact, virtually the entire Taino ethnicity and other natives of the Caribbean had gone extinct through a combination of enslavement, warfare, and epidemics, completely changing the demographic landscape of this region forever. What exactly is the Caribbean, though? Well, other than being used to describe the large open body of water connected to the Atlantic Ocean as a geographic descriptor, the Caribbean region, or West Indies as it is colloquially known, is generally used to describe the various island chains that box in the Caribbean Sea from the Atlantic Ocean, divided into a number of archipelagos stretching from South America to North America, including the Lesser Antilles in the east, which includes Barbados, Trinidad, and others, the ABC Islands in the south, which includes Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao, three constituent countries of the Netherlands, the Greater Antilles in the west, which includes Cuba, Hispaniola, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico, and finally the Lucayan Archipelago in the north, which includes the Bahamas, Turks, and Caicos Islands. At European contact, there were around 1 million people living throughout the Caribbean, including over 700,000 on the island of Hispaniola, which on this one island would have been a population density about the same as Argentina today, or 3 times higher than that of Canada. However, keep in mind that these early Caribbean natives were not a single unified ethno-linguistic group and arrived in their new island home at varying points in time, although interestingly, nearly all of them seem to have originated from South America rather than North America, despite the distance and close proximity to the mainland of both continents. But it's actually now known that virtually all Amerindian tribes in the Caribbean started on the northern coast of South America, what is now Venezuela, and proceeded to move north along the Lesser Antilles, hopping from island to island in various waves, and settling down along the way. The most archaic and isolated group were people located on the farthest western tip of Cuba and the nearby island of Juventud that were dubbed by the Spanish as the Guanahatabe, and were not related to any other known Caribbean natives or those from the mainland. As a hunter-gatherer society, the Guanahatabe were most likely descended from the first, or at least the oldest surviving migration wave from the mainland, most likely at least 3,100 BC. That's older than most of the pyramids of Egypt, at over 5,000 years old, although Amerindians have inhabited South America for at least 10,000 years. The next wave of migrants to enter the Caribbean were the Taino, perhaps the most widely distributed and most numerous people group in the region, and were distantly related to a larger ethnic macro-group known as the Arawakan peoples from the mainland of South America, with the Tainos spreading out to the Bahamas, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Hispaniola, and most of the remainder of Cuba, divided between a few main groupings which may or may not have been mutually intelligible. The other major group of the Caribbean was the Caribs, a smaller Arawakan ethnic group located in the Lesser Antilles. And before you ask, it was actually the Caribbean that was named after the Carib people, rather than the people being named after the region. The situation gets a bit more complicated for Trinidad and Tobago, which actually have multiple indigenous peoples, including the aforementioned island Caribs, as well as the Locono and Warao, while Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao were originally inhabited by Arawakan Caquito people, though due to their isolation from the rest of the Caribbean islands, their culture was more similar to that on the mainland than in the Greater Antilles. Areas that are also often associated with the Caribbean, such as Bermuda in the Atlantic Ocean, and the Cayman Islands in between Mexico and Jamaica, actually had no indigenous population by the time the first Europeans arrived, but that doesn't mean their modern populations don't have any Amerindian blood, as migrants brought from other Caribbean islands may have had partial native ancestry. So this leads us to what exactly happened to the million or so natives of the Caribbean, which, as you could guess, is quite the tragic history. As being the first area of the Americas that the Spaniards came across, it was also the first to be conquered and integrated into the Spanish Empire, with diseases such as measles, smallpox, and the flu being the greatest weapons of the Spanish, and the greater technological advancement of the Spanish put down any large-scale rebellions by the Taino. After this, many of the remaining natives were enslaved or fled to the interiors of the larger islands, although there was considerable intermixing between them, as many Spaniards who arrived on Hispaniola or Cuba often took Taino wives, with their mestizo offspring often becoming conquistadors themselves and aiding in the conquest of the rest of the New World. However, by and large, the biggest demographic change to occur to the Caribbean islands would be the importation of slaves from sub-Saharan Africa, who were quickly pumped in to replace the dwindling Taino population, and they would proceed to eventually become the majority in the French and British Caribbean territories, while in the Spanish territories it was a bit different, as most of the time the Spanish or mestizo men would intermix with these imported Africans, creating a new hybridized population. There are even some accounts of escaped African slaves moving and integrating into Taino villages, although eventually the entirety of the populations of these islands would become Hispanicized, with the Taino and African languages being replaced by Spanish, and racial identification on the island becoming rather fluid, with all inhabitants eventually becoming more or less connected in some way. Although anecdotes of surviving Taino exist well into the 1600s in the Greater Antilles, one of the only regions where the natives were able to actually survive the conquest, disease, and massacres were in the smaller islands, with England and France agreeing to make Dominica and St. Vincent into a Carib or Kalinago refuge, although eventually England would annex these islands as well, and with the importation of Africans to these islands, it would appear that the last of the native Caribbeans were about to be washed away forever. However, a group of escaped African slaves from St. Vincent would actually end up intermixing with some of the native Caribs, creating a hybrid Afro-Amerindian or Zambo people that were highly opposed to the British rule, and ended up being deported to Central America, where their descendants are known as the Garifuna, or Guaranagua today, still speaking their own distinct Arawakan dialect rather than English or Spanish, being located mostly in Honduras and Belize. In Dominica, however, the Kalinago actually did survive in the northeast corner of the island, making them the last remnants of the pre-contact indigenous Caribs, although in recent years there's been substantial intermixing with their neighbors in Dominica, leaving only a few hundred full-blooded members remaining, as most in the Kalinago community have African or European ancestry as well, but they're still quite the vibrant community, making up around 3% of the island, and growing actually. Due to the history of intermixing with many of the Caribbean natives, their genetics, and possibly even to a greater extent, their culture and traditions still live on in almost every modern nation in the region, as most Afro-Caribbeans have a degree of European and smaller Amerindian admixture, and in the case of the Hispanic Caribbean, it's been found through genetic studies that the whiter any individual is in these nations, the more likely it is that Amerindian DNA makes up a greater part of their non-European ancestry. In total, Native American ancestry still continues to make up around 7% of the overall genome of the entire Caribbean, greatly depending, of course, on self-identified ethnicity as well as region, as it's been found that mixed-race Puerto Ricans have around 20 to 25% Taino ancestry, while groups like the Haitians have almost none, existing only in trace amounts, suggesting a total population replacement. This may not sound like a whole lot, but out of the total population of the Caribbean being 45 million people today, this is equivalent to around 3.2 million full-blooded Caribbean Native Americans, with the highest geographic concentration being in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, although the modern Caribbean island with the highest percentage of Amerindian admixture as a proportion of the national gene pool would be Aruba. Not terribly surprising, seeing how it is one of the closest islands to the mainland. Even in most Anglo-West Indian countries, Afro-Caribbeans still have varying amounts of Amerindian DNA on average, possibly as high as 3 or 4% in Jamaica and the Virgin Islands, 5% in the Bahamas, and between 6 to 8% in St. Kitts, St. Vincent, Grenada, and St. Lucia, and possibly even higher than this in the Afro-Trinidadian population. Compare this to Black Americans in the United States, who on average have only 1% Native American blood, or the average white American who has even less than that, and it would appear that the United States, and I suppose Haiti as well, are some of the sole anomalies of the Americas, that being some of the only places in the hemisphere where Native American ancestry is not as widespread, as even in most parts of the Caribbean, their Native American genetics and heritage still lives on in the present day. In Puerto Rico, there has been a bit of a Taino cultural revival, with many embracing their indigenous roots, and in the 2010 U.S. Census, around 10,000 Puerto Ricans identified as Native American, being an interesting example of an ethnic group being revived literally from extinction, although many members of this Neo-Taino community have argued that there is simply a continuation of the former Taino people and culture, although it's unknown if these self-identified Taino have any more Native American DNA on average, or whether they just have the right amount of European and African DNA to look vaguely native. But either way, their embracing of their Amerindian heritage is part of a wider movement in Latin America to identify with the whole of their ancestry, uniting the region in their uniquely shared history, with the Taino, Caribs, and other Arawakan people native to the Caribbean being one of the most important chapters in that history. So please let me know your thoughts on the natives of the Caribbean, and for today's poll, let me know which region of the Caribbean you'd like to learn more about, either in reference to their native people groups or the modern people who live there today. As always, this has been Mason. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.
You're watching Ramping Up Your English. This is segment 2 of episode 98. We're going to look today at a very, very small word in English that opens up a huge amount of territory. And so the word I'm talking about is the tiny word, only 2 letters, if. Now, when you use if, especially in the past, you're going from things that are real to things that could have been. And so that kind of puts us in the whole subjunctive universe here. And so what we're going to do is take a look at some lessons in the use of the word if, and this is the past, looking at so it's kind of a conditional thing. It has the technical term of being subjunctive, because when you're talking about something that didn't happen in the past, and you're saying this would have been the result if that had happened, well, you're getting way away from reality. You're really just kind of putting your thoughts out there, but you're basing them on things that would have been possible to occur in the past, but did not happen in the past. So, a lot of explaining to do, but let's see how this rolls out.
If is a mighty small word, isn't it? We'll see that using this 2-letter word is the most complex thing I've taught so far. I always try to keep things simple, but there's a lot that goes with using this tiny word. Today, we're only going to use the word if to communicate things in the past. Now, what makes this complex is that we're using if to communicate things that did not occur and the results that were possible but never came to be because the cause never happened. The word if can be used at the beginning, or it can appear between 2 clauses. Today, we're going to use it at the beginning. I'll use a very simple example. If I had eaten, I wouldn't be hungry. In order to use the word if for past events, the verb that communicates the non-action needs the helping verb had or had not. Let's think about the message we're trying to convey. Using the helping verb had. In the past, I did not eat. When I say if I had eaten tells you I did not eat. You can also use the word not with the helping verb had. I had not had an appetite since I already ate. Now, this kind of thing can really make your head spin, but some thoughts need if statements to indicate that a different outcome was possible, but the cause was not present for that outcome. It may help to look at what we do with the main verb to communicate this complex idea. The main verb in the sample sentence is eaten. It's the past participle of the verb eat. Now, as a participle, it needs a helping verb. For this past situation, we use the helping verb had. Now we have the same construction as the past perfect verbs, as we had in previous lessons. However, we're using this with the word if. That indicates that the action is the opposite of reality. The first part of the sentence that uses the word if is called the conditional clause. Let's look at the second clause. I would not be hungry. Again, we see the opposite of reality. I am hungry because I didn't eat. In this clause, I would not be hungry, the word would indicates subjunctive mood. Looking again at the first clause, if I had eaten is a positive statement, but it's not true. Looking at the second clause, I would not be hungry, this is a negative statement, but it's also not true. If statements often join positive statements with negative ones, or a negative statement with a positive one, but not always. Here's how we put an if statement together. We'll use the word if at the beginning, then use the past perfect tense of the main verb to communicate what did not happen. To do that, we use the helping verb had with the past participle of the main verb. After that, we separate the clauses with a comma or semicolon. Then we use the modal verb would or would not for the hypothetical effect. Beyond all this grammar, let's find the pattern in some examples. Language is all about patterns. Now you might remember that Columbus first brought his idea to the King of Portugal, but the king rejected the idea of sailing west to reach Asia. Now we get hypothetical. If the King of Portugal had sponsored Columbus, Spain would not have had first contact with Americans. Notice that the first part is a positive statement of what didn't happen, and the second clause is a negative statement of what did not happen. Let's do some more examples to establish the pattern. If Columbus had not sought support from the Catholic monarchs, his voyage would not have happened. If Queen Isabel had not financed the voyage, Columbus would not have been able to do it. If the Spaniards had not found land, the crew would have mutinied. More examples. If the Taino had attacked the Spaniards, the crew would not have rested on San Salvador. If the Spaniards had treated the Taino with kindness and respect, an enriching exchange of cultures would have been possible. If Columbus had not sent slaves to Queen Isabella, she would not have sent them back to America. You can change the basic if statement to emphasize your thoughts. Let's use the word just in the conditional clause. If the Spaniards had just treated the Taino with respect, they could have learned to live well in their new environment. If the Spaniards had just been more humane, there would not have been so much needless suffering. You can change the meaning in other words with just a couple of words. Even joined with if communicates a totally different idea. Even if the Spaniards had treated the Taino humanely, many still would have died of European diseases. Even if the Taino had been hostile, Spain still would have colonized America. It's important to use hypothetical communication to establish the possibility that things could have been different. Using an if statement can help you do that. In today's lesson, we construct these statements by leading with the word if. Then we use the past perfect tense of the main verb, followed by a comma or semicolon to separate the clauses. Then we use a subjunctive mood with the word would or would have with the past participle of the verb. Good news! The past participle is often, but not always, the same as the past tense. Knowing all that, here's some extra practice. Complete the sentences you see here, using your own thoughts to come up with a possible conclusion. even though you know it didn't turn out that way. If you want some homework, practice using if statements from things that have happened in the past. The slides you're seeing and all others that are used in this episode can be found at my website, letscreate.org. From the home page, click on the Native Americans unit and then select episode 98. That's where you'll find them.
You're watching Ramping Up Your English. This is segment 3 of episode 98. As we're recording this program, you might notice we're not in the studio. And kind of happy to be outside on a beautiful morning. But the reason we're not in the studio is because there is a highly infectious disease going around the whole world called COVID-19. And this thing about disease and being contagious has everything to do with Native Americans. When there was contact with Europeans, the Europeans brought with them the germs, the viruses, the maladies from Europe. And since these two continents had never had interchange before, the Native Americans had no immunity to these diseases. And so the results was absolutely horrendous. In some cases, 90% of the population of certain villages were wiped out by these diseases for which the Native Americans had no immunity. Well, those are not the most positive or uplifting thoughts, but we do believe in reality and facing reality. If reality had been faced earlier in my own country, the United States, then there may not have been nearly as many people affected and died because of this. So, I know I've mentioned this in other programs, but especially looking back at history, we're doing this social studies unit. It's important to recognize reality, or reality will impose itself upon you. And I think that's what's happened in many places, including the United States, is you can't spin it away. You can't explain it away. You can't BS it away. It is... It's the reality. It's there. And there's something in a strange way refreshing about the fact that those who've lived in a fantasy world are being made to confront reality. But at what a cost? Well, with that thought, we're wrapping things up. So thank you for watching Ramping Up Your English. This ends episode 98. So see you next time on Ramping Up Your English. I'm John Letts.
You've been watching Ramping Up Your English, a support program for intermediate level English language learners. Learn more. Visit our website at letscreate.org. You can also watch or download today's program at archive.org/details/roguetv. Join us next time on RBTV Voices for Ramping Up Your English.